This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. The last time that our friend Amanda Becker was here on Political Theater, it was over the summer. We were talking about the anniversary of the Dobbs Supreme Court decision, which struck down the constitutional right to abortion. And we made a promise that we would bring her back for when her book, You Must Stand Up, which is about the first year after Dobbs and the reaction to it among abortion rights proponents, anti-abortion actors, particularly those in the public and political sphere and others. And now this review copy that I have been working off of is even out of date because, Amanda, you have
the real thing,
the book, which comes out next week. And I think this is a good time to talk about it before the really important people want to talk to you.
You're always the most important, Jason.
Before you're on, podcasts and the Tonight Show, I guess, and things like that.
No Tonight Show requests yet.
Okay, yet that's the key word. But your book, Amanda, You Must Stand Up. It comes out on Tuesday. Is that it's the 10th?
Tuesday, September 10th.
And this is a big deal. This is your first book. Let's give a quick refresher for those who may not have the previous podcast at the tip of their tongue. And also just a quick bio note. You are the national correspondent for the 19th News, but you're also, most importantly, a Roll Call alumna here. So welcome back to the show, and let's talk about your book.
Yeah. So this book kind of had the genesis of it was just I knew that Dobbs, when it happened, first of all, everyone who writes about abortion rights or abortion law and politics knew that Dobbs was coming. It was just a matter of time to see which case was going to be the one that overturned Roe. And so I had started kind of mentally preparing for that because I not only thought it was going to be a huge story in terms of healthcare and the court and civil rights, but I knew it was going to be potentially the biggest political story of my career. And so, I started putting together kind of this proposal, and that's how this book came to be. And I think what we're seeing, as we head into the first presidential election with no Roe v. Wade in 50 years, we are seeing that this is pretty much the biggest political story of this era. We just got polling this week, over the past week, from New York Times, Siena poll, that abortion is starting to overtake the economy as top issues among voters. And for women 45 and under, the ones who can get pregnant, it's already the most important issue. And it's also the most important issue more broadly among groups of voters in swing states where their rights are at stake. So that's kind of why I started working on this. And, the timing just ended up working out really well in terms of, what is happening right now in the book coming out.
And let's talk about the structure of the book a little bit, because I know that at one point, you were talking about how difficult it was to just shut things off because you wanted to focus on that year and the reaction after the in the 1 year after the decision. So this did encompass the 2022 midterm election, in which, abortion rights certainly was a factor. Particularly in some of the closer elections, but you did have to just sort of turn it off. So let's talk about how you decided on the folks who you wanted to make a part of your book, because you have several people who you come back to, an abortion clinic executive director in Alabama, a doctor in Arizona. There are several people who there are some one-off chapters, where you sort of, make a note of when, in Massachusetts and their reactions. But there are several actors with which you really sort of focus on them. How did you decide, when you were sort of delineating and were just faced with this onslaught of news and, just so much going on, how did you structure the book the way you did?
Yeah. So I actually wrote the proposal based off of a clinic in Maryland that ended up being that they were opening, which ends up being one of the one-off chapters that you just mentioned. The kind of core geographic areas of the book are Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Phoenix, Arizona. And I know we both love talking about Arizona politics. You're from Arizona. I just like the politics there because they're weird and wild. And so I was kind of looking for areas that would show how living in America right now, you're living a very different life potentially based on where you are. And also based on where you are, depending on where you are, your reality can change dramatically at any given time in terms of the type of healthcare that you're trying to access, because it's not just abortion. When there are abortion bans in place, there's a cascading effect that affects other kinds of healthcare. We can talk about that in a minute. But so a lot of it was I just started asking around, and Robin Marty, who's the director of the clinic in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where abortion is now fully banned, she used to kind of be in a media adjacent space. She came up kind of during the birth of the liberal blogosphere and like all of that was happening, and then transitioned kind of into direct work, first for an abortion fund and now for this clinic. She's not a healthcare provider, but she kind of runs the operational side. And she, because of her background, is very media friendly. And so that made her kind of she just understands the media a little bit better. That's part of her official scope of responsibilities. Because I knew, and I was just very aware that this first year when clinics and direct healthcare providers were going to be trying to take care of people in a situation where a lot of times they were uncertain even what type of care they could provide. They were having to get people to other places. I was just very aware that I didn't kind of want to be an added stress to them on top of everything else they were dealing with. And I'm not saying I wasn't an added stress for Robin Marty. Robin, if you're listening to this, as always, I appreciate everything you spoke to me about over that year. And there
are even some moments where you're in the book yourself because she's referring to you.
Yes.
She's talking to like some students at Tulane, for instance.
And someday Robin has a book of her own out called it's a handbook. Just Google her name, Robin Marty, Handbook Abortion. It'll come up. And she'll write another one someday, I'm sure, a first person about her own experience with this.
No pressure, Robin.
Yeah. So, but she, so I kind of started with her. And so I started with the clinic in Tuscaloosa. And I had to ask them a few times before she, was like, okay, you can come on down. And I'd never written a book before, so I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to kind of choose who would be the heart of the book. And then through her, I said, well, I'm really interested in also following somewhere out west, like Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, somewhere out there, because I wanted to get like a good geographic cross section. And she said, well, you need to talk to Dr. Goodrick out in Phoenix. She would be a natural for this. Texted her and she's like, yeah, sure, come on out. So I went out to Phoenix, and I consider kind of those two settings and those two people specifically to really kind of be the heart of the book. And then, of course, there's also the chapters from Maryland as two women are trying to open an all-terms clinic there. There's a chapter in Massachusetts that I chose to kind of feature. I mean, A, I was up in Massachusetts when I was writing this book, but B, it's also a state where the vast majority of people support abortion rights, even more so than nationally. It's like one of the highest in the country. I think it's the second highest in the country. And they're doing a lot of really creative things to protect access. So I wanted to, show a place where people on the local and state level had gotten really creative about how to protect abortion access in their state, because that is something that their residents wanted. Wisconsin, is a chapter that I get into about that Supreme Court race there and how kind of pivotal that was. But I also use it to talk about medical education and like the impact on, I follow a med student and she wants to be an OBGYN. How do you train to be an OBGYN in a state where you're prohibited from learning key parts of healthcare? Because what you learn related to abortion also applies to miscarriage. Miscarriage, goes into your medical chart usually as a spontaneous abortion. So, that has cascading effects because, people tend to practice in the areas where they train. There's already maternal health care deserts in Wisconsin because there are no OBGYNs. And then I would say like Kentucky is the other one that really comes to mind because I'm following just everyday voters in a red state who are campaigning against a ballot measure. So abortion was already banned in Kentucky, and they were still trying to put something to add the ban into the Constitution, which would, of course, make it much harder to ever restore rights legislatively. And so I followed just voters who just, one of them had never done any sort of door knocking or anything before. I wanted to, kind of see what that felt like on the ground to just be like, I've had enough. I'm taking to the streets type thing.
The one of the passages that stood out to me when this is in the chapter in which you sort of dissect the Justice Samuel Alito's Dobbs decision. He wrote the majority opinion for it, and one of the things that struck me about it is that this, for the Federalist Society, which is a conservative law organization, which has, that they kind of put their stamp on, this is the way that we think that judges should behave, and this is like the jurisprudence they think that should be followed.
These are the judges we want.
These are the judges we want. Republican presidents, when they're drawing up their list, not just for the Supreme Court, but every district and appellate court nominee, usually they want the sign off of the Federalist Society. A lot of the nominees are members themselves. There's been this sort of truism that, like, if only this would be restored to the states, Roe versus Wade wouldn't change. It would basically it would empower people to make their own decisions on abortion, as opposed to having a right, like it would return it to the political process. And that there would be clarity in that. And we've seen some of this messaging from Donald Trump and Republican candidates who, they say that there's nothing wrong with Roe versus Wade was flawed jurisprudence, and we've just restored, things to 50 years ago. But there's this passage that you have talking about this back and forth in Louisiana, which I had to like circle it and
probably had to read it multiple times, depending on what it was, to understand what was going on, because that's how it is.
Yes, this is great. But this isn't a description of the sort of chaotic legal landscape that we are still living with, 2+ years after Dobbs. This is just this small thing about and how Louisiana laws were affected. If you were a doctor, this is like the summer of the decision. This was only a few weeks out after the decision, not even now. If you were a doctor in Louisiana trying to keep up, in just over a month, abortion went from legal to illegal to legal for now to illegal for now to legal again for now to illegal pending the outcome of the underlying lawsuit.
Yeah. That
was a month after the decision.
That's what that summer was like. That's what that summer was like in Arizona too. And in the decision that you were just referring to, the majority decision, he wrote, this is just going to make it so much better. We're moving this from the courts. The courts have just been really taxed trying to figure out how to apply Roe v. Wade on all of these other abortion restrictions and, what can pass muster and what can't. And, they keep coming up to the Supreme Court. LOL, like that, like the courts have not been removed at all. And, Justice Breyer in his, in the liberal dissent, he was like, not only is this not going to clear things up on the, from a legal standpoint, we're headed towards the interjurisdictional abortion wars, right, which is exactly what has happened. There are state courts. There are a couple, I would have to look, as of like 6 months ago, there were about 40 cases pending in various stages related to abortion bans in states. Some of them are in state courts, some of them are in federal courts, kind of like depending on what the legal arguments are. But this is all over the courts now, and it's going to continue to be, because that's what happens when you take, healthcare, make it political, and then have 50 different standards in 50 different states. Well,
and again, the significance also of the court taking a right away as opposed to expanding rights is unprecedented.
It's the first time it's ever happened in modern history.
And I think that the real value in the way that you structured this book and having a hard cutoff too, right? This is what we deal with as reporters and journalists all the time, is that we would love to keep reporting because the story doesn't stop, when we, hit send. But the value in this is that this first year was so chaotic and so weird and so bizarre. And having people the way that you depict people trying to figure this out. And these are not, some people are more political than others. Obviously, if you're going to get into abortion care in the South or the Southwest, you have to have some sort of political radar about you in order to do your job and to be aware of the world that you're existing in. But there are a lot of different people, healthcare professionals, executive directors, some of these folks are not medical people. They're people who are just trying to keep a business and a and some of them are structured as nonprofits going. But like seeing the way that the political, cultural, and just logistics, unfurled over the course of a year is really valuable, I think, because this is, as you said, this is going to keep developing. We have an election in 2 months. I think that it's only going to gain in prominence, and who knows how this is going to turn out in the debate on Tuesday between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. I guess that's going to come up.
I really hope it comes up, because that will be a true dereliction of duty if it doesn't.
You have a passage.
I do. Yeah. So I have the 30 pages that you're missing. And this is...
I have a PDF of it. For those who have not gotten some books, press-related books, and this is what sometimes it looks like at the very end. It's just blank pages that they send you saying TK, and this was summer 2020.
Yeah. So the afterword, and I'll just read the first paragraph of the afterword. So afterward, this is spring of this year, 2024, Dateline, United States of America.
It's a big dateline.
Yeah. And because, the other chapters have the dateline of where they're set, but this was everywhere. So, and I'll just read this. It's pretty short. For the first few months of 2024, I tried to decide how to end this book. How could I leave readers with the most up-to-date information possible as abortion access continued to ebb and flow across the country, and any single court ruling or election could change everything in an instant? And that is why, under the great advice of both my editor at Bloomsbury and I think even my agent during the proposal stage, we proposed a year, because this is a story that is going to keep going. It's a story that I think is turning into what could be a major political realignment in this country. Realignments are kind of hard to see when you're at the beginning of them. And it's only much later that, scholars and political scientists look back and they're like, oh, the great political realignment of whatever. And, I could have spent 10 years on a book about this, or I could spend one. And, maybe that's a future book to do on the other years, or part of a future book. But I just decided that it was really important. This first year was going to be very pivotal and kind of portend what we have down the pipeline. And to cut it off after a year, even though it feels abrupt in some ways, and I do get into kind of updates as of the spring and the afterward for each of the places where kind of things were in flux. You just had to do it that way. So I just had to kind of be disciplined and, sometimes there were a couple major things that happened immediately after my year timeline ended. And I work, the most major ones into the afterward. I anticipate that the afterward for the paperback next year will, be the election that results from this year and kind of how that changed things. But yeah, it was, and it's different, right, from even a big magazine piece, because when you're putting a big magazine piece to bed, it's running in a week or two at least. So it still feels really fresh. This, I turned in this manuscript a year before it published. So, yeah, it was just I think there was really no other option. I had to cut it off somewhere.
Yeah. And I like what you said too about sometimes it's difficult to see when you're at the beginning of a political realignment, but something is changing, this does predate also Joe Biden dropping out of the race.
Yes,
and Kamala Harris becoming the nominee. I think that is going to be identified as one of the major drivers, regardless of what happens in the election itself and who wins. But the rumblings were going on a long time before. When do you start calling a war?
Yeah.
Because the groundwork for conflict is typically laid for years in advance, and I feel like it's interesting that again, Arizona, no surprise, I like to talk about Arizona because it's my home state, but I also agree with you that the politics of it are really interesting, because you do have this electorate where it's like a third Democrats, a third Republicans, a third independents, and the independents are not really like independents the way that they're polled a lot of times, where they're lean.
It's not the same as moderate. Independence is not the same as like swing voters.
Right. They're people who really don't want anything to do with either party.
Yeah. Especially in Arizona.
Right. Especially in Arizona. And there is a big influx of folks in Arizona from other states, and some of them are liberal and some of them are conservative. There are probably a lot of conservatives from California who moved to Arizona thinking that it's
more friendly to them,
right? More aligns with them and their beliefs. And I think also the way that you approach like the Barry Goldwater, this is the 1964 Republican nominee. He was looked upon as the sort of gold standard of conservatism for leading up into the Reagan Revolution.
The father,
yes,
of conservatism.
And abortion was never like he was before he was abortion rights before there was even necessarily a term for
his wife was on the board of the Arizona Planned Parenthood.
And I remember like even when and again this guy was as conservative
and also by the way supported LGBTQ rights,
right? Because it makes me think of, again, I'm not trying to echo any Democratic talking points, but when Tim Walz has trotted out this "mind your own damn business" like line, that very much sounds like Goldwater to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that, again, like why would you want to be in somebody's bedroom? Why would you want to be in their doctor's?
Well, these are the Republicans we're seeing support abortion rights measures, right, even when they're able to vote on them directly, right, even if they still identify as a Republican. Like crossover voters in Florida are going to be make or break whether that amendment passes. They're relying on a coalition, probably skewing towards women on the Republican side in terms of who they're hoping to woo over. But they're hoping that no matter who you vote for in your Congress races, in your congressional races, in the presidential, in your state house races, that you will feel free when it's put directly before you to kind of vote as the Goldwater Republican you identify as, right, and vote yes on that.
And I think there were 8 and counting ballot measures.
There were up to 10.
Okay, there are up to 10 now.
And there could be potentially an 11th and a 12th. I think we're waiting on some final filing deadlines and things like that and signature gathering. But right now there's confirmed 10. One of them is subject of legal challenges right now in South Dakota. I believe it is. It's one of the Dakotas. And if that's invalidated, it will just negate the outcome of the election. It's my understanding people will still be voting on it in November.
And these are also, again, there isn't necessarily if you support abortion rights, that means you're going to vote for a Democratic candidate, but that certainly would be something that the party.
Well, that's what Democrats are hoping.
Right?
Yeah.
In places like Montana, where they have John Tester.
Where, by the way, the president of Planned Parenthood is campaigning with John Tester this week.
Right. And again, I Montana is another state. It's not growing in the same way that like Arizona or Nevada or North Carolina or Texas or Florida is, but it is seeing this influx of people from other places. And who knows if they're more conservative or more liberal or more moderate or independent. But when the electorate basically changes, it just makes things really fascinating to cover it.
Yeah.
Right. As a political folks. So, we have an election to cover also, but like you do have a lot of marketing for your book.
I do.
Like, what's that going to look
First
like?
of all, I confirmed it is South Dakota.
Okay.
And then Nebraska actually has 2 different measures on it. So they actually have an anti-abortion measure and an abortion rights measure.
Right.
So that would technically be 10 states and 11 amendments right now. Yeah, marketing. So if you're in DC, I'm doing several local events, Politics and Prose at the Wharf location, Friday the 13th, because, I'm a big horror movie aficionado. So, and I feel like it kind of fits. So I'll be there on the 13th. The next week on the 19th, I'll be in Tacoma Park at People's Book. Mm-hmm. And then in early October, there's a literary festival on the Hill. And I will be at that on that Sunday afternoon, October 6th, is when all the panels are. So,
okay.
Several local events for people here in DC.
And then you'll also be doing stuff across the country.
Cincinnati, Ohio is scheduled right now. Cambridge, Massachusetts is scheduled right now. Trying to get something set up for Phoenix. Trying to get something set up for Chicago. Trying to get something set up for New York. But also I am covering the election. So
that old thing.
I was just talking to my editor on the way here, and I said, I was just looking at the calendar, and I think we're going to have to make some choices about which races I'm traveling to cover, because I can't be in multiple places at the same time. So,
yeah. So out of, if you had your pick, where, and looking at your interests, the interests of the 19th, and possible, like dovetailing with just the research you've done for your book, what would be like your top 3 races that you would?
I absolutely am going to Arizona to cover that Senate race between Ruben Gallejo and Kari Lake. And I will be spending some time in Michigan, because that's not only really important as is Arizona for the presidential, but we have a really important Senate race there as well.
A current House member and a former House member, Mike Rogers, a Republican, former Republican member from Michigan, and then Alessa Slatkin is a current Democratic House member. Also, both were in national intelligence.
Yeah.
He was a former Intelligence Committee chair and FBI agent, and she was a former CIA analyst. So, those are the 2 places I was like, I have to get out to those places. I could potentially get back to Wisconsin by November. There's not only the Senate race there between Tammy Baldwin and Eric Hovde, which I'm really interested in. And I've been out there to cover that race in the past. Actually, I went out last summer, but would love to go back. There's also a woman OBGYN who's running for House out there in a district that has been red, but getting less and less red. And if you look at the Supreme Court election results in that district, it's a nonpartisan race on paper, but there was a liberal and there was a conservative. The liberal Justice Protasewicz did better, overperformed in that district, essentially. And so I'm interested in her because there are no women OBGYNs in Congress right now. They're all men, they're all white, and they all oppose abortion. And so she's kind of explicitly run, she and another woman in Minnesota, actually, but that woman's in a safer race. Would love to kind of get out to Wisconsin for both the Senate race and just to talk to her about, why does a doctor put aside their medical career because they feel like they need to run for office based on protecting the type of healthcare they were trained and have been providing to patients. Should also note that the title of the book is from Dr. Goodrick
in Arizona.
In Arizona, I'm a huge fan of using quotes, to illustrate, what's ahead, and I like that each one of the chapters is basically a quote from one of the people who you're interviewing. So. Again, September 10th.
Yep.
Put your orders in. Even outside of the healthcare implications of it, this is a fascinating political read. It reads like a political thriller.
I'm a political reporter,
Yes.
So that doesn't surprise me. Somebody asked me to describe it the other day, and yes, it's a book about abortion on its face. But I think what it actually is, I used to say as I was writing it, I was telling the story of Democratic erosion now that I have it in front of me and have read through it a few times in its finished form, I really think it's a handbook for how to participate in democracy and insist that our democracy start working for people and start representing people, and showing through a variety of people that there are roles for all of us to play in protecting our democracy. You just have to figure out what your specific piece of it is.
Amanda Becker, thank you very much for a repeat performance.
Thank you, Jason. I always love coming here
to Political Theater. I don't know how many times you've been on, but I know this is at
three
least,
or four.
This is at least the third time. So we'll have you back when you're doing the sequel. No, I'm kidding. For other,
I have a lot of material, so
no, we'll have you back on.
Always happy to come talk politics and abortion.
All right, thanks.
All right, thank you.
And thank you for listening. If you have liked this podcast, please subscribe, tell your friends, review it. Only positive reviews, compliments only, if you will, to basically refer to my favorite sandwich shop here in DC, and subscribe. Thanks a lot.